All right, welcome everybody. This session is a Q&A panel here on science communication, and we're very privileged to have three excellent panelists, three experts in science communication that come from very different areas or angles or perspectives of science communication. And the goal today is to allow you, all of you in the audience, to engage with them in some Q&A. So I think this is going to be really interesting because each of our three panelists brings a very different perspective and has very different experiences or applications of this broad idea of science communication. So I'll be the moderator for this panel. My name is Abel Gustafson. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Communication here at the University of Cincinnati. I conduct research on public opinion of science and environmental issues, and my research works to develop more effective communication strategies when communicating about science and environmental topics. I'm also a faculty affiliate of the UC Center for Public Engagement with Science, and it's my great pleasure to help facilitate this fantastic panel today. So what I'm going to do is first introduce each of our three panelists and then give them about 5 minutes to describe their own work in science communication so that all of you can get a sense of where they're coming from and what kind of things that they do. And then I'm going to kick off the discussion with a couple of general questions to each of them. And then for the remaining 45 or 50 minutes or so of this session, it's going to be open for all of you to ask questions. And you can do that by submitting your questions in the chat. So it's going to be helpful when you submit questions in the chat for each of these panelists to mention who the question is directed towards. So if you can mention that in your comment in the chat, that would be very helpful. And of course, if you have a question that's directed at one or more than one of them, you can do that too. That's also fine. So, and then I'll pull questions out of the Zoom chat and I'll read them to our panelists. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our three panelists today. First, we have Nancy Averett, who is a freelance science writer who covers science and environmental issues from Cincinnati, Ohio. She's an award-winning journalist, and in 2020, she won a first-place award for feature writing from the Society of Environmental Journalists. She employs active listening, careful questioning, keen observation, robust research, and stellar writing to craft unforgettable content. Her passion is reaching into the minds of smart people doing lofty work, scientists, engineers, doctors, to bring out the humanity behind the research. So we're very excited to have Nancy Averett with us today. Our second panelist is Dean Regas, who has been the astronomer for the Cincinnati Observatory since 2000. He's a renowned educator, author, national popularizer of astronomy, and an expert in observational astronomy. From 2010 to 2019, Dean was the co-host of the PBS program Stargazers. He is the author of 4 books, including Facts from Space and 100 Things to See in the Night Sky. Dean is a frequent guest on National Public Radio's Science Friday with Ira Flato and NPR's Here and Now. He also hosts an astronomy podcast with Anna Heyman called Looking Up. At the Cincinnati Observatory, he's developed his skills as a dynamic writer and public speaker who brings the complicated field of astronomy down to earth for students of all ages. So we're very excited to have Dean Regas with here on the panel today. And last but not least, John Lynch is a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Lynch's teaching and research focuses on the rhetoric of science and medicine, especially on how the public understands science. He teaches courses in rhetorical criticism, the rhetoric of science, and research ethics. His current research projects examine public debates about research misconduct and how scientists process and attribute authorship to members of their research team. His recently published book is titled, What Are Stem Cells? Definition at the Intersection of Science and Politics. So we're very excited to have Dr. John Lynch with us here today also. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to our three panelists, starting with Nancy and then moving to Dean and then John. And each of them are going to take 3 to 5 minutes or so to describe their work in science communication, the things that they do and the perspective that they have on science communication through their work. So I'll turn it over to Nancy at this time.
Thank you, Abel. And hello, everyone. As Abel mentioned, I'm a science writer. I thought I would just give you a little background on my career. I started out as a working for daily newspapers in 3 different states, Missouri, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And back when you could have a viable career in newspapers. And I didn't cover science back then. I did a lot of things like crime and the courts and public school education and even covered some of the 9/11 attacks. But when my family moved to Ohio in 2006, I decided to become an independent or freelance journalist. And I kind of somewhat serendipitously fell into science journalism. I pitched and wrote some stories for Audubon magazine. And then I was at a conference and I met some women who were doing science journalism. And they sort of invited me into their tribe and this listserv for freelancers to support one another. And I just became very intrigued with what they were doing. And so I decided I wanted to follow in their footsteps. And I found that I really, even though covering science adds another layer of complexity to journalism, I think, because it's you have to do all the things that you do already as a journalist that are challenging, like finding the right sources and getting them to give you the information that you need. But then you have this extra hurdle of understanding the science on top of that. But I found that I really liked sort of that extra challenge, and it was very satisfying to me when I could finally think, oh wow, I got the science part, and then I could take that information and turn it into a story that the average person could relate to and be entertained with, but also learn a bit of science along the way. So just as far as my work, I did start out sort of writing about critters, I like to say, wildlife, birds, and other wildlife for Audubon. But I've really expanded from that since I've been doing this in the past 10 years. I write a lot about pollution, and I've done some environmental justice work and also environmental health. They're kind of interrelated. And I've also done a lot of stories on climate change. And but I've also branched out into the harder sciences. I've done some stories on all kinds of basic research. And I should say, in addition to writing for publications like Audubon and Discover and Scientific American, I also sort of have a side hustle where I write for universities and institutions. So in those cases, sometimes I'm explaining some scientists' really obscure research, but trying to make it accessible also. And I think more and more freelance journalists are doing that sort of, they have one foot in the journalism world and one foot in the, I guess you would call it PR, but it still feels very much like journalism world. Anyway, so I think I mentioned that. Oh no, I didn't mention this. So lastly, I just want to say that I did not have a love of science growing up. I didn't like science in high school. I didn't take much in college. So I really do not have any type of professional science background. And a lot of science journalists do. I know lots of people with PhDs that do this. And I'm sure that is a tremendous asset for them. But I like to say that I have my own secret weapon in that I am really the average person. And so when I talk to a scientist or write about it, I have to understand it. And if I can understand it, then the average person can. So I don't get caught up in, as I think you can, if you have more training or a deeper background, the jargon and the sort of higher level explanations that are really lost on the average person. So yeah, and I'll just end it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. That's such a wonderful practical perspective on science communication and such a rich body of work and experience. I'll turn it over to Dean Regas now for a quick summary of his work on science communication.
Thank you, Abel, and thanks everybody for coming today. So my background is I went to school to be a classroom teacher. Then I got into the classroom and I was like, I don't think I want to be a classroom teacher. It is a tough job. So I then went into the informal ed world where I worked for the Cincinnati parks doing nature ed. And at one of the parks, they had a planetarium. And for folks that have done informal ed, you know, every week you gotta learn something new. So this week was learn how to work the planetarium. And I just fell in love with the subject and dove in and learned all that I could, and just found my calling in life is to talk about the stars and the planets and everything up above. So I started working at the Cincinnati Observatory, and then was hired on as an educator, and then kind of worked up to be an official astronomer. And it is, I got to say, the coolest job in the universe, by the way. I just need to put that out there. Being an astronomer is really cool. But what I've found is that people have this innate interest in the universe. And I had to develop a way to communicate that to people. And similar to how Nancy said, is that, that most people want to have something that's approachable. You want to make it accessible. And that was my goal, was to kind of break down the difficulty, the barriers that people might have for science, and think that it's, it's so intense and so intimidating, and make it a more accessible subject. And similar to Nancy, I had to teach myself. And so I remember those things that made it, really engage me. And I try to communicate that through various methods. So I started off as writing a regular column for the Cincinnati Enquirer, the local newspaper, about astronomy. Then that branched off into radio, TV, and then was on the PBS show Stargazers for 9 years, coming to your TV screens every night at probably 1 a.m., prime time, and telling you about the stars and constellations. And then since then has been kind of moved towards other media, or trying to engage people with podcasts, books. There's lots of different avenues for that. And it's one of those fields that is so, it's just so cool. That's the idea, is you want to capture this coolness of this adventure, this exploration of the universe. And I think that's the key. Probably you'll see this with all of us here, is that we're innately curious, and we want to get that across to people as much as possible. And so I joke with myself halfway that I'm like the intermediary between the stars and the Earth. Okay, it's half joking, but if it's actually more of a thing that there is this level of the really scientific PhDs making these unbelievable discoveries, and how you communicate those discoveries to everybody is a very difficult skill. And that's something that I think it's something that is super important to be able to have that combination of curiosity, expertise, but also a way of making it accessible. And so, yeah, access and engagement, those are my two kind of keywords that I go with whenever I try to write and get things that the best stories, I think, are the ones that get people to do something, to get outside and look up at the sky, or look at a supermoon like we had, or a conjunction or an eclipse, that kind of thing. That's the stuff that we really makes a difference. And I think is in this last year, I think that's been our kind of our mantra, is to get people outside while you're stuck in quarantine. And there's these messages that really resonate pretty well, I think.
Thanks, Dean. That's really great. It's great how you're able to pursue your own interests and passions, and at the same time be able to activate or unlock or access that within all the people that you reach, because everybody has a lot of these same intrinsic curiosities or interests about the universe. That's really great. Yeah,
and enthusiasm is contagious, and it can get translated through writing too. It's not just for podcast TVs, but yeah, that enthusiasm you can read between the lines and see it. At least I hope so.
All right, let's turn it over to Dr. John Lynch here for a quick intro to his work on science communication.
Okay, so the academic sort of like, I've always been a PhD. I went in, I knew even in like undergrad that I was like, this was more interesting, because at one point I was like, I want to do journalism and newspapers. And then my newspaper advisor was like, that career is not long for this earth, in the mid 90s. And I was like, okay, time to look for a backup, and music is not it. So, so I've always been somewhat interested in science, and I've had, I guess, three projects that have always sort of included science, but also a little bit of ethics. The longest running began when I was a PhD student at the University of Georgia, where I was working on projects around the public understanding of genetics, race, and medicine. Because especially at that time, there were some people saying, well, as a proxy, we can just use race as a proxy for genetic diversity. And we explored how people reacted to that, to those various types of proposals. And that work I continued when I started my job here at the University of Cincinnati. I've been collaborating for 12 years now with folks in genetic counseling at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And we've been working on how do people understand genetics, how do people understand the family health histories. And most recently, we've been working on a series of small videos to help sort of explain what genetic research is. That the initial proposal is to help with recruitment, but it's also meant to serve an educational function for anyone. And you can see our first video, which was way too long, at like 18 minutes. For those who are interested in doing videos, never make anything that long. Please don't do it. You will lose your audience. That and the much shorter videos that I've eventually been able to get us to. If you go to YouTube and type in Lynch Medical Rhetoric Lab, you'll find a channel that has all of those videos that we leave publicly available. My second area has been working on the discourse around stem cell research, looking at how scientists who are exploring this new idea, especially of human embryonic stem cells, how they came to try and use language to understand what they were discovering. It was unknown even to them until they found it. How they do it, then how did politicians and journalists respond? And so that is my book, What Are Stem Cells, that Abel mentioned. Since then, I've done work with grad students looking at PR about stem cell research, especially PR from Cincinnati Children's and Cincinnati, and how people try and promote their work and use these institutional resources to make that happen. And also, I did another project looking at dubious stem cell clinics, where you'll go in and they'll give you stem cells to cure everything. And I mean, literally, they promise everything, and it's all bunk. But the strategies in which that bunk is performed are notable and very much like science communication. Finally, my last area has been building out of the research ethics work I did. I've been looking at how people remember events like Tuskegee and some of the more problematic moments in medical history. So there have been those dynamics and challenges that we've been considering. I've also been working with my students again on how people remember the 1918 flu pandemic in this past year about COVID, and how that sort of shapes our reactions to events that we've encountered. So that those are many of the three sort of large project areas that I've been working on the past 15 plus years now. So I'm still going.
Yeah, that's fascinating work, thinking about the rhetoric of science, not just what's effective and how can we accomplish our goals, but rather what are we communicating by the way that we communicate? What does it say about our values and our perspectives when we talk about things in the way that we do? That's really fascinating work. So again, thank you to these three panelists for being with us today. The next step here is we're going to start this discussion section. So I'm going to pose a couple of general questions to them first. And all of you panelists are free to jump in and answer these initial questions at any point. There's no need to go in any particular order. I'm interested to hear all of your diverse perspectives based on your experience. And after these couple of general introductory questions, then we'll open it up to questions from the entire audience. So you in the audience, if you have questions that you're interested in hearing answers to from our wonderful panelists, you can submit those in the Zoom chat. You can start submitting those at any time. So the initial questions that I want to get your sense on from these panelists here is I want to start off by hearing your perspective on kind of this like, so what question. So what are your thoughts on the importance of science communication? So there's a lot of like areas and topics and aspects of communication that we could study and we could try to improve or investigate. So why science communication? Why this? So what is the general question?
I think why study science communication has sort of at least a twofold sort of set of issues or importance. One, science and medicine have really sort of shaped and continue to transform our lives. Thinking about all of the medical progress, especially against infectious diseases in the 20th century, that this transforms what it meant to sort of live in the developing world. And also the way that the work of technology and medicine gets distributed, while we get a lot of benefits, like all of our technological trash, old computers and everything else get dumped in developing countries. So there are environmental and medical harms to what we've done. We've changed the world in ways that are great and in ways that are awful through the use of science and medicine. So we need to understand and be able to talk about those things. Second, I think science communication needs to be studied because that science communication crosses from the lab into the halls of Congress, into university deliberations about budget. It shapes all life. Science can't be sort of hermetically sealed. We'll lock away the lab somewhere and it'll eventually float back to us with knowledge. The ways that scientists learn to talk, the ways that scientists learn to work in a lab are shaped by communication as well. And so it's always a sort of sliding scale as we move from the public to the most tightly controlled labs. It is always, communication is always there. It's not the totality of science, but it is always a component, and we need to take it seriously.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that, most definitely. From my kind of perspective on this, science communication, is entertainment, number one. Whether you're just getting something on your phone, your feed of like, this is what was discovered today, smallest black hole ever found. It's a wow factor. And so, I mean, that's a pretty light approach to it, but it's an engagement that can get people kind of inspired a little bit. So you can turn that kind of wow factor into something a little bit more. And that's the true test, is to make that second step, because you put a statement out there that a near Earth object will fly by Earth within 1 million miles, and everybody's like, whoa, 1 million miles, that's not very close. No, it's not very close, but it makes news. And so you have to watch out for the other side of that. And that is the sensationalism side. That is now something that at least in the astronomy field, we have to address. And unfortunately, I think there's another factor that is really important, is there is an educational part to this, is that there's so much information out there that it's hard to weed through what's the real, what should I really get excited about? What should I not get excited about? And there's folks that work for NASA and other places that are still trying to get a hold on that as to what is the best way, what are the best topics to get out there. And so just having a more scientifically literate readership is definitely a huge benefit for this, because we have to kind of impart these skills to separate the facts from the sensationalism, which is, as I think we probably all know, is very difficult right now.
Yeah, so I'll just add that I think science can be very powerful to the average person if they can have some basic understanding of it. I've done some work interviewing people that live near polluting industry. And in fact, I did a pretty big story about really the lack of science that is done in those situations, that there's a lot of unknown science in terms of what those pollutants do to people's health. And just giving people who live in those places the tools to be able to talk about science and pollution is hugely empowering to them. So I think that's one really good reason to have good science communication. I mean, on a broader perspective, what we've all been going through in the past year is an example of why science communication is so important to all of us. We've seen so much miscommunication around the pandemic. And even, I know early on there, I think it was Dr. Fauci who said, and the CDC, that we didn't need to wear masks because they didn't think the coronavirus was airborne. And I actually tried to do a story on this idea of airborne viruses, and I learned that it's incredibly hard to prove that a virus is airborne. It's just the science involved is long and tedious. Like the whole figuring out that tuberculosis was airborne took decades, and so the idea that we were going to figure that out in a few weeks with this virus was not realistic, but there were a lot of signs, and there still are, that it's airborne. So anyway, I guess I'm just saying that because, there was this confusion about whether you should wear a mask or not in the beginning. And that has affected, that's not the only reason, but it has affected, at least in the beginning, whether or not people were going to wear masks. And people would say, well, those scientists said back in, April that we didn't need them. And now they're saying we do. It's not the scientists' fault, but it's just an example, I guess, of how critical good science communication is. So, and science obviously touches all of us all the time. So, and as a society, I think we need to do a much better job of communicating science. So.
And Nancy, what I was thinking just from what you said is that, there's like this double-edged sword. It's like scientists are respected, except when they're not respected. It's like there's this weird kind of thing. It's like, well, you said that back then, and then they're like, well, now we're not so sure. So you do have at least a level of respect among a good center of the population, which is very heartening. I know that there is a little bit of like distrust, or maybe a little. The scientists are not held in as high esteem as possible. But I think that that's the thing you have to work with, is that among some people, it is like they are the highest, and others it's not. And so working that is definitely challenging.
Yeah. And as you mentioned,
go ahead, Nancy.
Go ahead. I was going to say, as you mentioned, Dean, there's so much information coming out. And I think that's especially true with this pandemic. I'm a science writer, and I get fatigue, like with all these coronavirus stories, COVID-19 stories, and the changes that I can't keep up with at all. So I can't imagine that the average person who's less interested in science is going to follow all of these. But it's I can tell you as a freelancer science journalist, if you had a COVID-19 story, I mean, you were golden last year, but trying to get anything else, an editor interested in anything else, was very challenging.
One thing I like about a common thread through all of these perspectives is really the power of science and the power of communicating science, whether it be for entertainment and enjoyment, or whether it be for giving people information that they need to make wise decisions, or whether it be for just directing the course of society overall. Like science and science communication are so impactful for good or for bad. Whether if we do it poorly, it can have bad effects. If we do it well, it can have great effects. So just the overall power and effectiveness of science communication is a common thread running through all of these responses. So before we open it up to questions that are coming in through the Zoom chat, I see a lot of great questions coming in. I want to get your perspective really quick on a second general question here. Maybe if you can just give a quick response to this. In your mind, what do you think some are some like common misconceptions are about what science communication is, or maybe about misconceptions about what the goals of science communication are, or what it means to be a science communicator. Like what is a misconception that people think that this is what this means, but really in practice or in reality or maybe in ideals, this is actually what it means or what we should be aiming for?
Well, I think there is a lot of there's a lot more two-way conversations happening than in the past, and obviously there's a lot of misconceptions because social media has sort of created these communities of doubters that I'm not well versed enough to say what's driving that, but so I think maybe a common misconception is just that everyone's going to believe the scientist. There's just, I've met just too many well-educated people that will tell me something and I'm thinking, where did they hear that? And the power of social media and that tool is just, it's scary.
That's a great misconception that people are just going to believe scientists when they hear the information.
Yeah, I think of two things that come to mind of that is kind of one misconception I think people have about science is that it's like it's set in stone, it's facts, it's like this monolith, and we figured this stuff out, and so we just have to like keep doing this. But in the field of astronomy, it's all constantly evolving. There's our understandings of things in the universe are always changing, and scientists by and large are very accepting of that. They, if you're an astronomer nowadays, you put out a theory and it gets disproven, you can't like have a thick skin about that. It just happens all the time, and because it's a constant moving to making things better. And I think that's the idea of science is, we don't have the full picture right now. We are still explorers in this, and we're trying to paint these pictures pretty well. And then the other thing that came to mind when Nancy was talking was, in the astronomy world, there's two big misconceptions. One is on the wane, thankfully. That is that we never went to the moon. That's one thing that comes out. And luckily, that is the number of people thinking we never went to the moon has gone down significantly. The one that's coming up that's even more startling is that the Earth is flat. Now that one is we're getting more and more proponents of that, which is, it's baffling. It's as a scientist that, we proved this 500 years ago is just like pulling my hair out. But the approach that I've taken to the conspiracy theory crowd is not backing off, not backing away and saying, not leaving things unanswered. I know a lot of people say, don't engage. But I've tried various methods with very bad results. But there's just, I just feel like in my gut feeling, my experience is you can't let it go. You can't, you have to kind of do it. But that's the thing is we need to have a way that we can make a little more scientific, literate community. And that's a big challenge, definitely.
Yeah, those are great points. I'm really intrigued by that first point because scientists have a very different understanding in relationship to uncertainty than most everybody else does. It's kind of counterintuitive. People would assume that scientists are more certain than other people are, but that's not the case. It's quite the opposite. Scientists are the most uncertain because they have a different understanding of uncertainty.
And the word theory is has a different meaning for different people. It's like, I have a theory that the Earth is flat. I was like, well, okay, that's a theory. That's actually not a theory. That's an idea. Then so a theory. That's the other thing. It's very difficult to confer that off and just say, well, yeah, theories are not just like wild ideas. These are like there's evidence-driven things, and so that's the thing is following the evidence is always the key factor for us.
Any thoughts, John, on misconceptions about science communication or science communicators?
So I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I'm going to focus on a misconception that I think is common amongst scientists, whether in the physical sciences or the biological and medical sciences. There's always, like, if they only knew what we knew, or this desire, like, all we need to do is just give people the proper information. I like using this language, especially with medical doctors. It's the hypodermic theory model of communication. Like, oh my God, someone doesn't believe in vaccines, given them 70 cc's of information, stat. Somehow it doesn't cure people when you just sort of vomit facts on them or tell them that they're wrong. I encountered this actually most concretely when I was studying the Creation Museum in just over the river in Kentucky. I had an ND PhD from children say, well, if only they understood evolution. And my response was, they understand evolution. They just don't like you, and they fundamentally disagree with all of your values and worldview. You have to deal with that before you can get them to answer questions of evolution right on some sort of test. So it's not just giving information. It is scientists have to come to terms with the values of their audience and figure out, are they going to try and challenge or adjust those, which is amazingly hard to do? Or are they going to try and accommodate some of those? And accommodation often happens to be the right way. And there have been other science communication and rhetorician of science folks who have looked at sort of trying to talk to skeptics across a number of fields. And it's amazingly complicated and frustrating. Even sort of reading about sort of what you have to do, there are times I'm just like, forget it. I can't do this. And I do this a lot. So I mentioned this to emphasize that, yeah, if you're in a place where, if you're working in a field with high skepticism, you are, or like you get to normally just talk about the supermoon, but now you have to deal with the flat earthers. There's going to be moments where you want to pull your hair out, and you just got to figure out a quiet place off camera, not on your Zoom meeting, to go do that.
Yeah, I have a good example of one kind of along those lines. I had a talk with a group. It was a homeschool group, and they I think they were young Earth believers, that the Earth was 6,000 years old. And so somebody asked the question, where did the sun come from? And so I answered. I have to say, this was like the best answer I've ever given to that question. I was like, that this is we know where the sun came from. It came from this collapsed nebula that came together and formed into this new star. And over all these years, it evolved into this. And then we know this because those elements are in your body. The heavy elements from a supernova explosion were in you, and all the iron in your blood, the jewelry you're wearing, all came from an exploded star. And there was this little girl sitting on her mom's lap in the front row. And she was just like, her eyes were all big. And she looks up at her mom and she's like, "Mom, really?" And her mom looks down and was like, "Nah." And I was like, oh my God, that was like my best performance ever. And I almost got him. But that's the thing, is that we have the better story. Science has the better story to this. And all we have to do is tell that story. Because if it's heard, I'm sorry, you can't compete. The old story is not going to compete with our modern science. And so that's the thing, is, can we tell the better story every time? That's what we got to do.
Those are all excellent perspectives. I appreciate your responses on that question. So let's turn now to questions coming out of the Zoom chat here. One of the questions that I see is an interesting one. So the question is, there's different goals of science engagement, like understanding, appreciation for aesthetics, collective action, getting people to do something, among others. Do you have one goal that stands out in your work? Like, what are the success conditions for that goal?
Yeah, I would say if my one would be accessibility. I think that's kind of my goal is in my communication is just kind of saying, this is stuff that you could see. This is stuff that you could do. This is stuff that you can reason also. Those are the ones that I find the most effective. Those are the kind of stories that I like to read myself also. So that'd be that this is accessible to everybody. That this isn't just astronomers up on their hills and their white domed observatories. This is for everybody. And wow, what an amazing universe. That's my main goal. But you're right, different audiences, you have to have different things. But that's kind of who my niche that I've kind of worked in is my audience is the general public, basically.
That's great. No pressure to chime in, other people, but you're free to if you have something else to add on top of that.
I would just add that I guess what I really care most about, and I think this is because these are the stories that I like to read, are trying really hard to bring forth the sort of human side of the science. I was once I participated in a workshop to help train scientists at a university to be better communicators. And it was really hard to get them to talk about themselves. But I think showing people that the scientist is human, even if it's just a few little details about what you see in their office or their gestures, or I just wrote a story about this big tree planting effort at the University of Louisville for a pollution study. And the main PI was this very dapper man who always wore linen suits. And he came to the tree planting just so, smelling of aftershave. But it just sort of said a lot about who he was. Like, he wasn't really going to pick up a shovel and dig holes like a lot of the volunteers were. But I don't know. I just think that those things, if you make the scientist human, that kind of dispels some of the myths of what science is to the average person. So that's something I strive for.
And perhaps it could even help counteract some of the skepticism and misinformation, because sometimes people have this stereotype of scientists who are this, some sort of abstract, stereotypical, like bad guy who's in cahoots trying to influence the world in some way that they don't like. In reality, it's just a bunch of everyday people doing their best and who are curious about something and trying to figure out answers to it. All right, we have another question out of the chat here. This is from Kevin Elliott. And the question is, or Kevin says, this is perhaps most directed towards John, but I'd be happy to hear from everyone. Given your interest in rhetoric and ethics, John, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how to engage in science communication that is persuasive without being inappropriately manipulative. In the previous session, we talked about various strategies to try to get people to accept scientific knowledge, using narratives, finding communicators who match the audience's identities, and so on. Do you have thoughts about how to determine when our efforts cross the line into being manipulative or ethically suspect?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I don't know that I have a good answer for you, despite the fact that I have that I work on sort of issues around ethics and research ethics, because I think in many ways it's very situational. Obviously, not telling bold-faced lies, avoiding some of the. Actually, no, I just came up with something, and it ties back to the social media stuff. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a prolific sort of public-facing science communicator, an ambassador for science in many ways. But recently he had like a couple tweets about sort of like science is truth. And so I think once we start moving into this sort of evangelical mode, we get into trouble. And then luckily there are people who will call you out. The interesting thing is the person or the group that called Tyson out the most was the social media manager for Steakums, which is some like frozen meat disgusting thing, who basically did this sort of like popular reading of philosophy of science. about how sort of science is a process. It is not the truth. And so I think that evangelicism is one place that really I think I can identify a clear line. The rest is a narrative too manipulative, will really depend on case-by-case bases. A very humanizing story can be good in a lot of cases, but there might be a place, especially with biomedical issues, where you're really just playing on the heartstrings and just probably need to back off. But again, that's situation by situation. So sorry, I don't have a better answer beyond Steakums.
That is a great answer. I mean, uncertainty is one of science's best attributes. It's kind of the engine that keeps science moving forward, and it's one of the ways that we can keep iterating towards being less wrong about stuff. So maintaining that uncertainty, I think, is a valuable goal or aspect of science. I'm interested to hear if Nancy or Dean, if you have any perspectives on this idea of when science communication can cross into an unethical territory by trying to be manipulative or trying to be too persuasive or trying to convince people to see the world in a different way. Is there a line there that we should be worried about crossing?
Well, certainly if you're writing from a journalism perspective, your goal should not be persuasion. Though I think it can be kind of gray because a lot of journalists who write about these issues do care about them, do believe in the science. So, but I think you can, certainly, obviously one of the oldest methods for journalism is to present both sides of an issue, although there's some criticism around that, right? Because there's so much agreement that climate change is happening, and there's so little in the scientific community, people who don't think it's happening, scientists who don't think it's happening. So if you present both sides, it's not a fair equivalence.
Yeah, I would say that's kind of it's not a big concern, I'd say, for the average journalist is to throw in their own opinions in there. I don't see that very often in most of the journalism, and that at least the mainstream. Nancy, I think you're right too, is that idea of this fair and balanced thing. It really breaks down pretty quickly with science, because there's the thing, so we need to tell both sides of the story. So we need to tell the astronomy side and the astrology side. We need to show the chemistry side and the alchemy side. That's not responsible to do it that way. So there is not just like one science that, this is the word, but it has to be something that comes from a pretty good consensus and peer reviewed and all that as we normally do. But the fair and balanced part is not, can be taken way too far. I think that's probably the biggest danger, I think, is taking it that far.
Sure. Yeah, those are all great perspectives. So a second question coming out of the chat here. This is from Brenda Hunda. How do we get the public to understand that science is iterative and that what we know changes as we get more information? It's not that scientists are lying or disingenuous, but rather that the process of science itself promotes advancement in our knowledge with more evidence.
It's very challenging to do in a very short amount of time. So if you have a 500-word article, if you have a minute and a half, to give the whole history behind things is very, very difficult. It's something that would require a longer thing. Knowing the kind of the history behind certain discoveries and how it's changed. There are definitely some science communicators out there that have kind of this way about them of saying that this is how it is, and this is how this is how everybody thinks it's going, and you just have to watch that doesn't come across. I see interviews with certain astronomers, and they talk about string theory or parallel universes, and they say all these great things about all these things that we know about the universe, and then at the end, the interviewer always says, "So what's the evidence behind these things?" And they say, "Oh, well, we don't really have any. It's just kind of like we were kind of thinking about it." It's like, so you just told me all about parallel universes and you don't have one shred of evidence to show it? No. So you're right. That is, there's a tone, and it's the amount of time that you have with an audience that can hopefully get out. But it's super, super challenging to do in a 30-second spot. You have to give the history of how the distances to stars, our understanding of the distance to stars have changed. And we think Betelgeuse is this far away right now, but last year we said it was closer. And that's the history of science is filled with filled with changes, that's for sure. So yeah, getting across that we're trying to make it better. That's a tough. I wish I had more advice on it, but yeah, if somebody could give me how you do that in 15 seconds, that's tough. Attitude, I guess, is the way that I try to do is not, I'm not giving you all this info from down on high. I'm working through this too, kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm interested in Nancy's perspective on this also, because this is probably something that you encounter as you report on scientific developments. I'm sure there are times where we used to think one thing a year ago and now our knowledge has changed, and that's the reason for writing a particular article.
Right. And I think maybe the more controversial the subject is, the harder it's going to be to convince people that the science has changed. The earlier we were talking about the mask, early in the pandemic, you didn't need to wear a mask, scientists thought, and then that quickly changed. But it was so imprinted in people's brains that, I was just thinking of, I wrote a story about a community in Louisiana that has, was deemed by the EPA to have some of the worst air pollution in the country because there's a factory that makes this one chemical that the EPA had just decided was a likely carcinogen. And the EPA did a study that showed how much of this is called chloroprene. This chemical could be in the air, certain cubic meters for it to be fairly safe. And it was way above that. And I don't remember what the measurements were, but it was something like 0.2 something. And so all the community has rallied around bringing the levels down to this 0.2 level. And I was just following up, seeing if there had been any changes, because this was before the pandemic when I went down there. And now there's been a new study, and it seems like a pretty good study that says actually a higher level is going to be safe. And I just can't imagine how they're going to sell that to the community down there because there's a lot of other issues at play, mistrust of the regulators, mistrust of the industry. But I was struck by it seemed like there were independent scientists saying this is a pretty good study, this kind of thing happens. But that's going to be a real challenge to successfully convince the community that the level of chloroprene could be higher and they would still be safe.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree that the type of issue really influences the degree to which we can successfully show the public that we're operating in good faith as we change the evidence or as we update our beliefs in regards to the evidence. So we have another question coming in from the chat, and this is a little bit shifting gears, but it's a very interesting question. I think it's something that's very timely and important. This is from Lauren Cagle. And this is a question for everyone, but she says, especially for John, given your work on race-based science. Lauren says, I would love to hear your thoughts connecting this event's conversations to ongoing social movements related to racism and white supremacy. That seems especially salient given how many of today's panelists so far are white or white presenting.
So thank you for that question. And this is an issue that I'm going to take it in sort of two levels. One, thinking about sort of this group, but also science communicators, rhetoricians of science, either academics, practitioners, but also scientists themselves. There are issues of underrepresentation. There's a need to continually do some soul searching to find out what are the barriers that we've put into place deliberately in history or inadvertently now to in order to lower those and encourage greater diversities of people to come into these academic and practitioner spaces and to sort of resolve some of this. I think there's also the issue, sort of historically, one of trust and mistrust that is driven by these, that is a result of structural racism within our society. And so one way I think sort of do sort of an academic discursive way of thinking about this are some of the invocations of Tuskegee that have happened during COVID. So I have a friend of mine who will share snippets from Black Twitter with me. And so early on, there were invocations of Tuskegee there when the US government and some prominent sort of Black academics were encouraging Black people, people of color to enroll in vaccine trials. Tuskegee got invoked there. You're asking us to what? Do you not remember our history? Why are you doing this? And so some concerns there. Contrast that with white mainstream media uses of Tuskegee, which we're saying Black people aren't getting the vaccine because they distrust us, which was wrong. Because the Black people, while there is some distrust, Black people are not getting the vaccine because they didn't have access. It wasn't being provided in their communities. High-speed internet access was unreliable. So whoever had the most reliable internet got all of the appointments, even when a vaccine site was located in a community of color. And that was wealthier, older white people. Consistent, or the kids of those folks who helped them get their appointments. And so I mentioned that to highlight some of the structural issues in our communication, along with the structural issues in the composition of our community. And so I hope I have managed to provide at least one answer. I know there are probably many more possible answers to this question, and I turn it over to my fellow panelists.
I'd love to address that question. I think there's been a real concerted effort by journalistic publications and non-journalistic institutional ones to, since George Floyd's death and the protests over the summer, to really raise their awareness of the lack of voices from people of color in those publications. And one publication I write for has a list of, one of the requirements for writing a story is that you get an outside voice. So they have a list of scientists in the earth science field who are people of color. And they really encourage journalists to pick from that list when they're looking for this outside voice. I've written, I've noticed on just my sort of the groups I belong to, the Science Writers, National Science Writers Association, Society of Environmental Journalists, a real push to give fellowships and support to journalists of color. So I think there is, there's a long way to go, but I think in terms of getting more science communicators of color, I think there's at least a real awareness now of the need to do that.
So we have another question coming in from the chat here, and this is one that I'm really interested in. I think it's going to be really beneficial for a lot of people in the audience here, and it brings together a couple of different questions. So one of the questions is from Gray O'Reilly, and he asks, for students interested in pursuing careers in science communication, how do you suggest we go about it? There seems to be a lot of avenues, for example, a PhD, freelance journalism, jobs in local communities. And then similarly, Brooke Crawley asks, following up on Gray's question, do you have advice for a scientist who's interested in pursuing science communication, perhaps considering some foray into journalism? So any of your perspectives on all of those things? I know you all are coming from different career backgrounds, so this should be really interesting.
I would say that anybody going into the scientific field should put communication as part of it. If not a minor, it should be part of your scientific career also. I guess the past of the scientific discoverer sitting in a lab by themselves making discoveries that's in the past. And that is one element that pretty much every employer is looking for, that if you have the science background, you're going to be doing these things, you have to also communicate those things. So yeah, absolutely. If you're going into the research field or any of the sciences, pick up a communication minor, I think, or at least have that as part of your thing. I know that with NASA programs, their NASA budget there's a lot of it earmarked for education. So they take these things very seriously, that they want to engage the public with their discoveries, because I mean, sure, it's probably partially self-serving. You engage the public likes it, you get more money, you do more of it, but that's beside the point. It's also very important to be able to communicate those things. And that's what the employers that I'm seeing that are hiring scientists, that is, you got to have that, or at least that makes you stand out to somebody, if nothing else.
Yeah, and I would just add, if you're interested in writing or any kind of that kind of communication, position, that and if you're a student or not, I would look into the National Association of Science Writers or Society of Environmental Journalists, because they have a lot of resources for people who are starting out. They have student rates you can join. They have fellowships. You can go to their conferences. And I find, I try to go to one of those conferences once a year, that there's just so much you can learn from being around other science journalists. And there are people all the time that are just starting out. There are, of course, more formal master's programs in science writing. I think there's one at University of California, Santa Cruz, that's quite good. MIT, I realize that's an added expense, but and there's certainly lots of people that are scientists that decide to become freelance science writers. The freelancing part, it depends on your tolerance for sort of hustling to get work and that type of thing. But then there are a lot of institutional science writing jobs that are great jobs, and you get to talk to scientists and you have a steady paycheck too. So there's a lot of great avenues if you want to do it.
And I don't think we can ignore the social media aspect too, since that's growing very, very quickly. I'm too old to understand how you make money off of social media, but you probably could figure it out by doing science writing. That is probably the biggest increase in that, and it's a lot of freelancers finding their niches, and yeah, so definitely social media is probably the big expansion to do that.
For students who are undergrads at UC, I'll make the gratuitous plug that, yes, we have a minor in communication. We also have a certificate in communicating science, health, environment, and risk, CSER. So definitely look for those. We also have graduate level courses in environmental communication and different elements of science and health communication. And there are also events like this one where you can begin developing sort of the rudiments of these skill sets as students, as part of your training, even through a postdoc. And so definitely look for those. I would also then say the Brooks question is one that's been sort of not addressed as much. And so I think the question is how much effort do you want to put in? How important is it for your career? Because you can try and do the Twitter route. Some of that will just be shouting into the void, except for that one tweet that goes viral and then sort of haunts you to the end of your day. Well, either is a good thing or will haunt you. It seems about 50-50 which one that will be. But the other element to do is to reach out regularly to the marketing communication professionals at the college level and at the university level. The university did a press release about my essay about the Creation Museum back in 2013. Another group of my colleagues examined a pro-anorexia website. They were interviewed by University Communications and had then multiple interviews and publications across the globe out of that piece. So PR is always going to be hit or miss. Of the stem cell article press releases we looked at, there were 20 and only 3 to 5, I think it was actually 3, ended up getting picked up by television or newspaper at the time. We didn't look for other avenues. So it's a roll of the dice, but it's another tool that you can use in addition to trying to create your own blog. Oh, finally, also reach out to your professional societies. They sometimes have a public-facing blog and they want people to write for it. I did this for the Hastings Center, which is a bioethics group, about 2 years ago. So see if your society has one of those public-facing, sort of quasi-open to anyone to author blogs where you can do some of your public-facing work as well.
Those are all excellent pieces of advice, and there's a wide range of opportunities in there. Although we probably shouldn't be holding our breath for Dean Regas's TikTok account to go live yet. All right, excellent. We have time for about one more question here, and this is an interesting one that I think about a lot of times in my work. But the question that's phrased here is actually a more practical one. It's not a question of like theory or understanding, the way that humans think. It's more about like how you approach science communication. And the question is, could each of you talk about how audience considerations impact how you approach science communication in different contexts or media? Like, who are you writing your books for? And how does your approach to communicating with a school group differ from a group of members of the general public? Different types of news organizations, whether they be science specific or a newspaper, et cetera. For all of you, this question I think is applicable, thinking about your audience and how that impacts the way that you do science communication.
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely the first question I ask before I start any assignment is who's the audience? Whether it's writing, public speaking, or whatnot. Yeah, you have to know who your audience is and absolutely have to cater it to that audience. That's the most effective way to do it. And I think that's just a good rule in life, actually. If you're going to anything, you're like, wait a second, okay, who am I going to be talking to? Taking a step back and looking at that. And then also taking a step back after the fact to say, okay, wait, was the audience different than what I thought it was? Is that did I analyze this right? Or was I told this was the correct audience? So definitely the pre-work, that's the step number one. And definitely you have to adjust your amount of syllables you put in your sentences, depending on which unknown newspapers that I might be talking about. You might only want to go 1 or 2 syllables for all your words. But I'm sorry, that was just too much. But if you definitely have to do that, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't do a lot of talking in front of groups or school children or anything like that. And I haven't done any writing for that audience. I guess when I was a newspaper reporter, it was probably a little less sophisticated, the type of writing I was doing. I feel like I kind of just write for myself, like what I think I want to hear. And maybe that's just because that's my comfort zone. But I don't think too much, my audience, I guess not everyone would pick up a copy of Scientific American and be excited about reading it. So maybe I should think more about it. But yeah, I guess I'm writing for a fairly educated audience most of the time, because that's who's going to be reading these publications. And it would be different if I were addressing a more general audience. So I'm not sure that's a great answer, but
I do like how it comes full circle to what you mentioned at the start, how you write for yourself. And if you can understand it, then your audience can. And I think that's really something that's valuable to keep in mind.
Yeah.
John, any comments on tailoring science communication to audiences?
The process that I was always taught was sort of figure out what you want to do, but also figure out where sort of an audience is. I think a challenge for science communication, especially some of like the videos that I created, is that I really have two audiences. It is the medical professionals, but also the community they're trying to reach, because I need to work with the medical professionals to figure out what it is that they feel that they need to sort of say, and also with the community to figure out what it is that they care to hear about and listen to, and sort of to try and get these two to work. And it often requires a lot more work with some of the professionals. Like, you can't, and this is why, like, I talked about my first video was 18 minutes long, because I got tired of doing that fight. They wanted to do everything that happens in the enrollment process or discussion for any clinical or research encounter about genetics, which is half an hour. I got them down to 18 minutes. So, I feel somewhat successful, but it was also a failure. And I was actually able to show them, like, here's a graph of people's time watching this. And guess what? 650, it's like a cliff. It's like people watch, boom. I was like, every single one of these videos has to be less than that. We can 4 minutes tops. And even then, we're going to still get, like, the adolescents you want to reach are going to get bored. They're going to fast forward through. And so trying to talk about those challenges. And I think that's one thing we have to recognize. Science communication, when we talk about how do we adapt to our audience, I think it's more, how do we adapt to our audiences, especially when our audiences have wildly different priorities and wildly different amounts of power. I got to work with the medical professionals because they have the money. We got the money together, or they have the money and are giving it to me. But they need to reach this group over here. And I'm like, you got to talk to them. You must learn their language. They're not learning yours. They have other things. They have more important priorities. And it's not learning to be a PhD geneticist. So, yeah. So recognizing those multiple audiences and tensions, that is going to be, I think, for someone who's not doing sort of journalism or education, but other types of science communication, especially medical communication, that's 95% of the job. And then making that appear in the products that happen along the way.
Yeah, so we've, that's a great place to end our time here. We are a couple minutes over time. We're ending basically at the number one rule for effective communication, which is to understand your audience. And that's a great place to be. All right, so there are questions that we didn't get to answer, and the team here is going to get some answers to those questions and post them in the Slack communities. In fact, some of the questions that we didn't get to answer are great segues from this, like what is the role of social media in science communication today? So there's a lot of incentive to join the Slack community and see some of the answers posted to that. And then also the next session here is our open networking session. So of course, there's more room for discussion in that forum as well. But I thank you all for attending. This has been a fantastic discussion. We touched on a lot of really great topics and got a wide range of perspectives on all of these issues. And a special thanks, of course, to our panelists, Nancy Everett, Dean Regas, and Dr. John Lynch for joining us today and sharing their afternoon here. So a virtual round of applause. You can use the emojis or whatever you feel to show your appreciation for our fantastic panelists. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions here presented by the UC Center for Public Engagement with Science. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Abel.